They came in waves. That is the tactic. Exhaust the defenders, consume their ammunition, force them to expose their positions, and then send another wave before the first has fully failed. It is a doctrine that treats soldiers as arithmetic. Enough bodies moving forward will eventually overwhelm any defense if the attacking force is willing to accept the cost. Days ago, Russian commanders applied that doctrine against Ukrainian defensive positions on the Eastern Front. They sent wave after wave of infantry, assault groups moving across open ground in the gray April light, using the pre-dawn fog that settles over the low terrain of eastern Ukraine each morning as partial concealment, accepting that some would not make it through in order to learn where Ukrainian fire was coming from, and to wear down the defenders' ability to sustain their response. Ukrainian defenders did not wear down. They adapted. They sequenced their fires. They held their positions. And by the time Russian commanders called off the assault in the late morning hours, the fields in front of Ukrainian positions held the evidence of what attritional infantry wave tactics cost against a defender who has learned how to fight them. And Ukrainian positions that had been targeted by 3 successive assault waves were still intact, still manned, and still holding the line. This is the story of how Ukrainian defenders, infantrymen, FPV operators, artillery crews, and drone spotters defeated a coordinated multi-wave assault that Russian commanders had designed specifically to overwhelm them. And this is what Russia paid for the attempt. The assault had been anticipated. Ukrainian intelligence observation of Russian positions in the sector had been tracking the assembly of assault elements, the infantry groupings that Russian commanders use for wave attacks, for approximately 36 hours before the first wave moved. The specific indicators were familiar to Ukrainian analysts, who had been watching Russian assault preparations throughout this conflict. Assault groups moving forward to jump off positions under the cover of darkness, increase communications traffic between company and battalion command elements, the repositioning of medical evacuation assets that typically precedes a planned assault, and the movement of additional ammunition to the fire support positions that would prepare the assault with suppressive fires. Ukrainian defensive preparation began immediately. The defensive scheme for the sector had been developed in advance. Ukrainian commanders do not wait for the assault to begin before deciding how to fight it. The plan for this specific approach against these specific positions, against an assault force using wave tactics, was already drafted, staffed, and resourced. What the intelligence picture triggered was the activation of that plan. The movement of FPV teams to their fighting positions, the pre-registration of artillery against the identified assault routes, the positioning of drone spotters at heights that would provide observation of the full assault area, and the establishment of the communications links between every element of the defensive fire system that would need to coordinate during the engagement. Ukrainian commanders had studied Russian wave assault tactics with the specific intent of developing a defensive response that could sustain effectiveness across multiple assault waves. Because the tactical logic of wave attacks is that each successive wave is supposed to find the defense more degraded than the previous one. Mines expended, ammunition running low, crew fatigue accumulating, defensive positions identified and suppressed. Ukrainian defensive planning for this engagement was built around defeating that logic, preserving the fire's capacity needed to engage each wave with equivalent effectiveness to the first. The first wave moved at pre-dawn, using the ground fog and the darkness that was still present in the April early morning to attempt to close the distance to Ukrainian positions. Before full daylight gave Ukrainian drone operators and direct fire teams the visibility they needed to engage effectively at extended ranges. The assault group moved in dispersed formation. Russian assault commanders have learned that tight formations are catastrophically vulnerable to FPV drones and have adapted their movement to present smaller target clusters. Individual soldiers moving at intervals of 5 to 10 meters, using whatever low ground and vegetation the terrain provided for momentary cover, presenting Ukrainian fires with distributed rather than concentrated targets. Ukrainian minefields were the first element of the defensive response. The approaches to Ukrainian positions in the sector had been systematically mined in the preceding weeks, not uniformly, but along the specific routes that Ukrainian engineers had assessed as the most probable assault approaches based on terrain analysis. The first wave encountered those mines as the leading elements reached the outer defensive perimeter. Several soldiers were killed or wounded by mine strikes. The assault formation slowed. The survivors moved more carefully, probing for safe routes, losing the momentum that the assault timetable required. Ukrainian direct fire teams engaged the first wave as it decelerated in the mined approaches. Precision fires against individual soldiers at the ranges involved require good observation and disciplined trigger management. The specific skills of Ukrainian infantry, who have been fighting this type of engagement for months. The engagement was not a broad suppressive fire response. It was targeted, deliberate, aimed fire against identified soldiers in identified positions. Ukrainian riflemen and machine gun crews engaged only when they had clear target identification, conserving ammunition for the follow-on waves that Ukrainian commanders knew were coming. The first wave did not reach Ukrainian positions. It stalled in the mined approaches under Ukrainian direct fire, took significant casualties, and the surviving assault elements withdrew or went to ground in available cover. The wave had failed, but it had done what Russian commanders intended it to do. Ukrainian defenders had revealed some of their positions through muzzle flash and tracer observation, and had expended some of their ammunition. Ukrainian commanders expected the second wave. The interval between waves was approximately 20 minutes, enough time for Russian command to assess the first wave's results, redirect the second assault group toward the gaps and routes that surviving soldiers from the first wave had identified, and initiate fresh artillery suppression of the Ukrainian positions that had revealed themselves. The second wave began with Russian artillery fires against identified Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian defenders had anticipated this suppression and had prepared their positions to ride it out. Reinforced overhead cover, dispersed fighting positions that reduced the probability of multiple casualties from a single impact, and the specific defensive discipline of staying in cover during suppression and emerging to engage when Russian infantry began to move. The second assault group moved forward as the artillery fire shifted to extend the suppression. They were moving faster than the first wave, using the ground the first wave had cleared of mines at cost, and using routes identified by first wave survivors as passable. They were also moving into FPV drone engagement range. Ukrainian FPV operators, who had held their systems during the first wave to preserve their capability for the more dangerous second and potential third waves, launched as the second assault group closed to their maximum effective engagement range. The drones targeted the soldiers who were moving fastest, who were closest to Ukrainian positions, who represented the leading edge of the wave that was designed to exploit whatever degradation the first wave had achieved. Multiple FPV strikes in sequence, each targeting a different soldier in a different part of the assault formation, disrupted the second wave's ability to maintain coherent movement. Soldiers who were still alive, but who had just watched the soldiers around them struck by drones, made the instinctive choice to seek cover rather than continue advancing. The second wave stalled. Unlike the first wave, which had been stopped primarily by mines and direct fire, the second wave was stopped by the demonstration that open ground movement under Ukrainian FPV coverage was survivable only by remaining stationary. And stationary soldiers cannot assault. Russian commanders initiated the third wave. They had no choice within the tactical logic they had committed to. Stopping after two failed waves meant accepting failure with the costs of two assault attempts already paid. The third wave was designed to be the exploitation force, larger than the first two, moving along routes that both previous waves had confirmed were passable with heavier fire support and the expectation of finding Ukrainian defenders exhausted and low on ammunition. Ukrainian artillery, which had been held at reduced tempo during the first two waves to preserve ammunition for exactly this moment, opened fully on the third wave's approach routes. Pre-registered fire missions that Ukrainian artillery crews had developed from days of terrain preparation were executed with the precision that pre-registration provides. Rounds landed in the specific corridors that the third assault group was using, the routes that Russian commanders had identified from the previous waves as the approaches with the best prospects. The third wave took the heaviest casualties of the engagement. Soldiers moving in the approach corridors that artillery was hitting had no effective cover. The fire was not area suppression. It was concentrated on the specific routes where the assault was occurring. Ukrainian drone spotters, maintaining observation of the full engagement area, provided real-time corrections that walked rounds onto the assault formation with an accuracy that open terrain movement could not survive. The third wave did not reach Ukrainian positions. Its surviving elements withdrew. Russian commanders called off the assault. Ukrainian positions that had been subjected to 3 successive assault waves, mines, direct fire, FPV engagement, and artillery across 3 separate assault attempts, were still held. The defenders in those positions had been fighting for several hours in April, cold, under Russian artillery suppression, engaging multiple assault waves in sequence. They were tired. They were not broken. They were still in their positions when the last Russian assault element withdrew. Now let us examine what Russia paid for this engagement. Infantry casualties in 3 assault waves against a prepared Ukrainian defensive position represent losses that Russian commanders accepted as the operational cost of the wave tactic. Conservative estimates based on the scale of the assault and the effectiveness of Ukrainian fires across all 3 waves suggest Russian casualties in the range of 150 to 300 soldiers killed or seriously wounded in this single engagement, at Russian current replacement costs for trained infantry, accounting for the mobilization and basic training pipeline that produces infantry replacements. Each trained soldier represents a state investment of approximately $15,000 to $25,000 in direct training and equipment costs. The personnel cost of the assault, $2.25 million to $7.5 million in direct expenditure, not accounting for the strategic manpower cost of losses that Russian mobilization pipelines must replace. The ammunition expenditure for 3 assault waves plus supporting artillery fires represents an additional $3 to $6 million in direct costs. Fire support for 3 separate assault sequences, the suppression fires, the preparation fires for each wave, the counter-battery response to Ukrainian fires during the engagement, consumed ammunition at rates consistent with a sustained combined arms engagement. Total direct cost of the assault, $5.25 to $13.5 million USD, for an engagement in which Russia gained no ground, no tactical advantage, and no operational progress. Ukrainian costs were a fraction of this figure. Ammunition expended across 3 defensive responses, maintenance costs for positions that sustained some damage from Russian suppression, and the logistical cost of the mine employment that stopped the first wave, all substantially less than the cost of the assault that was attempting to overcome them. The exchange ratio of this engagement is the number that matters. Russia paid millions of dollars and hundreds of soldiers for 0 meters of Ukrainian ground. Ukraine paid a fraction of that cost to hold every meter it was defending. Wave tactics work against defenders who run out of ammunition, who exhaust their positions' overhead cover, who cannot sustain effective fires across multiple assault sequences. Ukrainian defenders in this sector did none of those things. They sequenced their responses. They preserved their capability. They fought the engagement the way their training and their experience had prepared them to fight it. Russian commanders who ordered the 3rd wave after 2 had failed were not making a tactical error within the logic of wave assault doctrine. They were making an error in their assessment of the Ukrainian defenders they were attacking. They assessed that 3 waves would find those defenders degraded. They were wrong. The fields in front of Ukrainian positions in eastern Ukraine on an April morning held the evidence, and the positions themselves held the defenders. Ukraine absorbs. Ukraine adapts. Ukraine holds every wave that Russia sends. To understand why Ukrainian defenders succeeded in holding their positions through 3 assault waves when Russian commanders had designed the engagement specifically to overcome exactly that kind of sustained defense, it is necessary to examine the specific organizational and tactical capabilities that Ukrainian infantry units have developed, and why those capabilities represent something fundamentally different from the force that faced Russian assaults in the earlier phases of this conflict. Ukrainian infantry defending positions in eastern Ukraine today is not simply motivated. Motivation has been present throughout the conflict and has never been the limiting factor in Ukrainian defensive performance. What has changed, and what was visible in every phase of this engagement, is the degree to which Ukrainian infantry units have developed specific tactical skills for the specific problem of defending prepared positions against Russian wave assaults in the terrain conditions of eastern Ukraine. The mine employment that stopped the first wave was not random. Ukrainian military engineers and the infantry units they support have developed systematic approaches to mining the approaches to defensive positions that account for the specific movement patterns of Russian assault groups. The spacing, the route selection, the timing that Russian assault doctrine produces. The mines that the first wave encountered were not scattered uniformly across the approach terrain. They were placed at the specific points where terrain features, approach routes, and Russian tactical behavior converge to create the highest probability of contact. That placement reflects engineering judgment developed through months of observing where Russian assault groups actually move when approaching under fire, and placing mines in those specific locations rather than in locations that seem obvious from a map. The direct fire engagement of the first wave, the disciplined, identified target fires that Ukrainian infantry crews delivered rather than broad suppressive fire, reflects a specific training emphasis that Ukrainian military leadership has invested in throughout the conflict. Suppressive fire consumes ammunition rapidly and reveals positions through sustained muzzle flash and tracer signature. Identified target fires, engaging only when a specific soldier in a specific position is clearly visible, conserves ammunition, reduces position revelation, and achieves the same suppressive effect on the attacking force at a fraction of the ammunition cost. The Ukrainian infantry, who maintained that discipline through a sustained assault under incoming artillery suppression in April cold and fog, were executing a capability that takes months of training and operational experience to build. The FPV team decisions during the second wave represent a different dimension of the Ukrainian defensive capability demonstrated in this engagement. The choice to hold FPV assets through the first wave, accepting the risk that the first wave might achieve a penetration that the drones could have prevented in order to preserve their effectiveness for the more dangerous follow-on waves, was a command decision at the small unit level that reflects genuine tactical judgment. Ukrainian FPV teams operating in the defensive role have developed specific employment doctrine for exactly this type of multi-wave engagement. Not every wave requires FPV response, and the allocation of limited drone assets to the waves where their impact will be greatest requires an assessment of the overall engagement development that goes beyond simple target acquisition and firing. The artillery conservation that preserved full fires capability for the third wave is perhaps the most strategically significant element of the Ukrainian defensive performance in this engagement. Artillery ammunition is not unlimited. Every round fired in response to the first two waves is a round not available for the third. Ukrainian commanders had assessed correctly that the third wave would be the largest and the most dangerous, the wave that Russian commanders had held in reserve as their exploitation force. Accepting higher risk during the first two waves in order to preserve the fire's capacity for the decisive moment reflects operational judgment at a level that requires significant command experience to exercise correctly under pressure. The artillery correction that Ukrainian drone spotters provided during the third wave engagement also deserves specific examination. Artillery fires against a moving infantry formation in the terrain of eastern Ukraine, where low ground, vegetation, and the smoke of previous fires create a complex observation environment, require real-time correction to achieve the accuracy that can stop a determined assault. The drone spotters who maintained observation of the third wave's approach, who provided corrections that walked rounds onto the assault formation as it moved through the corridors Ukrainian pre-registration had prepared, were doing technically demanding work under conditions that included Russian fires directed at suppressing exactly those observation assets. Russian commanders who ordered the suppression of Ukrainian observation assets during the assault. The standard counter-observation fires that accompany Russian assault preparation were attempting to blind Ukrainian artillery correction capability. Ukrainian drone operators managing their flight profiles and altitudes to maintain observation despite Russian suppression fires reflect a specific counter-counter observation skill that has been developed through operational experience. The observation that survived to correct the third wave's fires did so because the operators maintaining it understood how to manage their assets under suppression. Now step back from the tactical detail and consider what this engagement demonstrates about the current state of Russian wave assault tactics in eastern Ukraine. Wave assaults are not a sign of Russian strength. They are a sign of tactical poverty, an approach that Russian commanders use when they lack the combined arms coordination capability to execute more sophisticated assault methods, or when institutional pressure to show forward movement forces operations that the force is not capable of conducting successfully by other means. Sending infantry forward in waves, accepting high casualties in order to find gaps and wear down the defense, is the approach of a force that has exhausted its better options. The casualties that Russian wave assaults produce represent a specific kind of manpower loss that is particularly difficult for Russia to sustain. Infantry who are lost in wave assaults are not primarily vehicle crews or technical specialists. They are the basic infantry that Russian formations depend on for every ground operation. The Russian military's ability to generate trained infantry replacements through mobilization is real but not unlimited. And the quality of replacement infantry produced through the accelerated training pipelines that current mobilization rates require is consistently below the quality of the experienced soldiers being lost. Each wave assault that fails and produces heavy casualties makes the next wave assault less capable of success. Not just because the immediate losses must be replaced, but because the replacements are less capable than the soldiers they replace. Ukrainian defenders who stop Russian wave assaults are not simply holding ground. They are degrading the quality of the Russian infantry force in their sector with each engagement, creating a compound attrition effect where the military value of each successive Russian assault attempt is lower than the one before it. The defenders who held those positions through 3 waves on an April morning in eastern Ukraine, the infantrymen who maintained fire discipline under suppression, the FPV operators who held their assets for the right moment, the drone spotters who kept observation through Russian counter-observation fires, the artillery crews who conserved their ammunition for the 3rd wave, did all of this while being cold, tired, under fire, and aware that more waves might come. That awareness, that the fight is not over when the wave fails, that another attempt may follow, and the ability to sustain effective defense through that awareness is a quality that is not easily described in military technical analysis, but that is visible in the outcome of every engagement where Ukrainian defenders hold their positions against wave after wave. 3 waves failed, the positions held, the defenders are still there. One final dimension of this engagement demands acknowledgement, the experience of the individual Ukrainian soldiers who held those positions through several hours of assault in early April conditions on the Eastern Front. April mornings in eastern Ukraine are cold. Ground fog at dawn reduces visibility to hundreds of meters. The soil underfoot is wet. The fighting positions, reinforced overhead cover, earthwork walls, the physical products of engineering work conducted over weeks, provide protection but not comfort. Ukrainian defenders in those positions before the first wave moved had been awake since before dawn, in cold and damp, watching the approaches for the movement that intelligence had told them was coming. The first wave appeared in the fog. The mines went off. The direct fire engagement began, and for several hours after that, those defenders absorbed the full weight of a Russian assault that had been designed specifically to break them. Suppression fires, assault waves, the psychological pressure of knowing that each failed wave might precede another. They maintained their fire discipline. They conserved their assets. They held. When the last Russian assault element withdrew, the defenders in those positions did not celebrate. They assessed their ammunition state. They reported their casualties. They improved the positions that Russian fires had damaged. They began preparing for the next engagement. That is what holding the line looks like from inside the position. Not dramatic, not spectacular. Cold, methodical, professional, and absolutely determined. Ukraine holds because its defenders choose to hold. Every wave that Russia sends meets that choice and breaks against it.